Welcome to the frontier. Close your eyes and picture this. It's the middle of the 1800s. You've just hopped off a creaky wooden wagon after weeks of bouncing along dirt trails, and what greets you isn't a cozy inn or a friendly town. Nope, it's a vast stretch of wilderness, towering trees, frozen rivers, and snowflakes already drifting from the grey sky. Congratulations, you're officially a frontier settler, and winter is coming whether you like it or not. There's no streetlight glow in the distance, no rumble of trains nearby, no corner store to duck into for a cup of hot chocolate. The only sounds are the wind pushing through the pines and maybe, if you're unlucky, the faint howl of a wolf echoing from somewhere where pinpoint. The frontier was beautiful, yes, but it was also unforgiving, especially in winter. Now, for people like us who start shivering when the thermostat dips a little below 70, it's hard to imagine just how brutal a frontier winter really was. But that's what we're going to do here. Settle in, pull the blanket up to your chin, and imagine stepping into those rough leather boots. Endless sky, endless cold. The frontier stretched for miles in every direction. Whether you were up north in the Dakota Territory, out on the Great Plains, or tucked into the edges of the Rockies, the land was wide open. That meant there were no neighbors close by, no bustling towns, and definitely no snowplows rumbling down the road to clear a path. When snow came down, it came down heavy, blanketing everything in sight. And cold wasn't just grab your coat. It's chilly outside kind of cold. This was your eyelashes freeze together when you blink cold. Settlers had to brace for months of it. Winter didn't politely knock at the door and stay for just a couple of weeks. It barged in, dropped its luggage, and made itself comfortable until spring. No turning back. The strange thing about arriving on the frontier was that once you got there, you couldn't just pack up and leave when things got tough. You couldn't swipe on your phone and book the next flight out of Dakota Territory. You couldn't call up a buddy to come pick you up in their truck. The wagon you rode in on, it was most likely long gone, or it wasn't going to get you through snowdrifts taller than your oxen. That sense of being stuck, of having to face whatever came, was part of the frontier mindset. Once winter set in, leaving was usually impossible. Families had to prepare months in advance, stocking food, chopping wood, and hoping they had enough supplies to last until spring thaw. If they miscalculated, the results could be deadly. A world without comforts. Think about the things you rely on today to get through winter: heated homes, warm blankets, microwaves, grocery stores with aisles stacked high with food. The frontier had none of that. If you wanted warmth, you built it yourself, usually by cutting down trees until your arms felt like falling off. If you wanted food, you hunted it, trapped it, or hoped your root cellar had enough potatoes and dried beans to last the season. Frontier life was about stripping everything down to the basics: shelter, food, warmth. That's it. No one was asking which Netflix show you were binging. No one cared if you were bored. The only thing that mattered was whether you could outlast the winter. First impressions of the wild: imagine being a family just arriving in late autumn. You crest a hill, look down, and see miles of untouched forest, and someone says, "Well, this looks like a fine place to settle." Sure, it's beautiful if you don't think too hard about the fact that there's no house, no barn, and not even a fence post in sight. For new settlers, those first few days were a mix of awe and dread. On one hand, you had endless land. On the other, you had the clock ticking against you. Winter wouldn't wait politely while you figured things out. The men usually grabbed axes and started cutting trees for logs. The women began figuring out where to cook meals without a kitchen. Children gathered sticks, fetched water, and probably wondered why their parents had dragged them into the middle of nowhere. It wasn't exactly the romantic adventure they had pictured. Wildlife watching you back. Another unsettling thing about the frontier: you were never alone. Sure, there were no neighbors, but that didn't mean no one was watching. Out in the forest, wolves moved silently through the snow. Bears lumbered into dens. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The settlers weren't just intruding on empty land, they were entering someone else's territory. And in winter, when food was scarce, those animals came closer. Wolves tested fences. Bears sniffed around cabins. That eerie howl outside your log walls. It wasn't just a sound effect for spooky vibes. It was real. The Frontier welcome package, if there had been a brochure handed to newcomers, it would have read something like this. Welcome to the frontier. You will freeze. You will chop wood until your arms ache. You will wonder if you brought enough beans. And if you survive until spring, congratulations, you're officially tough enough to call yourself a settler. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the reality. Why they did it anyway, the question is. Why would anyone choose this life? Why march into the wilderness, knowing you might not even make it through the first winter? The answer, as with many hard things, was opportunity. Land was cheap or even free in some places. Settlers dreamed of building a new life, owning farms, and creating a future for their families. Back in the crowded cities, jobs were scarce, factories were grim, and the promise of open land pulled people west like a magnet. But the dream came with a price, and that price was often paid during the first brutal winter. Could you survive? So here you are, standing in the snow, staring at an endless horizon. No warming behind you, no grocery store down the road, just the land, the cold, and your determination. It's not a question of whether you'd be comfortable, you wouldn't be. The real question is whether you could endure. Could you last with only your own two hands to keep the firewood stacked, your own skill to hunt or cook, and your own grit to keep pushing through the long, freezing nights? If you're still unsure, don't worry. Over the next chapters, we'll walk step by step through what life was actually like for settlers in those harsh winters. From chopping wood to making clothes, from dealing with loneliness to fending off wolves, we'll cover it all. For now, just pull your blanket a little tighter, sip whatever warm drink you've got nearby, and be thankful that unlike the settlers, you don't actually have to go chop firewood after this. Because trust me, you'd need a lot of it. Building shelter before you freeze, all right. You've stepped off your wagon, the cold wind smacks you in the face, and reality sets in. You need a roof over your head, and fast. Out here on the frontier, winter doesn't care about your plans. Snow is coming, temperatures are dropping, and if you don't get a shelter up quickly, you won't be around to complain about it come spring. So, what do? You grab an axe, find the nearest tree, and start swinging. Welcome to the exhausting, back-breaking, and absolutely necessary work of building your winter home. The clock is ticking. Building shelter wasn't a maybe we'll get to it next week kind of job. It was the first job. A family could survive a few days without proper food. They might even make do without a well right away. But without shelter, in the freezing wind, you might not last a single night. And let's be real, the shelter didn't need to be pretty. Nobody was going for a Pinterest aesthetic. You weren't worrying about matching curtains or rustic farmhouse decor. You just needed 4 walls, a roof, and a place to keep a fire burning. If it kept the wind out and the snow from piling on your head while you slept, you called it good. Log cabins. The classic choice. The most common winter homes were log cabins. Strong, relatively quick to build if you had enough hands, and made from the endless supply of trees around you. Settlers would cut down straight logs, strip off the bark, and then drag or roll them into place. Each log had to be notched at the ends, so they'd stack tightly together like Lincoln logs, except life-sized, heavy and exhausting. A family with a couple of grown sons or neighbors nearby could throw together a basic cabin in a few weeks. Without help, though, progress was painfully slow. The gaps between logs were stuffed with a mix of mud, clay, straw or moss. This kept the wind from howling straight through the walls. Without this chinking, a cabin was basically just a giant wooden flute playing cold air right onto your face. Sod houses and dugouts. Not everyone had trees handy, though. Out on the Great Plains, where the land stretched endlessly without a forest in sight, settlers had to get creative. Enter the sod house. Sod houses were made by cutting thick squares of prairie grass and dirt, then stacking them like bricks. The roots in the grass held the dirt together, making a surprisingly solid wall. Sure, your living room walls might sprout weeds in spring, and yes, the house smelled like earth every time it rained, but at least it kept out the wind. If even sod wasn't an option, Some settlers dug into hillsides and built dugouts. Imagine living in a glorified hole in the ground, with maybe a wooden door or a canvas flap for an entrance. It wasn't glamorous, but underground homes stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer. Of course, they were also damp, dark, and occasionally shared with critters you didn't invite in. A roof overhead, no matter what kind of shelter you built, the roof was key. A bad roof meant snow dripping on you in the middle of the night. A really bad roof meant the whole thing caving in during a blizzard. Cabin roofs were usually made from split logs or wooden shingles. Sod houses had grass roofs, which were heavy, leaky, and prone to collapse if you weren't careful. Dugouts often used branches covered with dirt. In every case, you were basically gambling that your roof would hold long enough to keep your family dry until spring. Windows. Forget about it now. You might be picturing a cute little cabin with a couple of windows to let in the sunshine. Yeah, no. Glass was expensive, fragile, and hard to haul across rough trails. Most frontier shelters had no windows at all. If you were lucky, maybe you had a small oiled paper window, basically animal fat smeared on thin paper to let in a little light. Otherwise, you lived in dim, smoky cabins, lit by firelight and maybe a homemade candle or two. Cozy in a storybook sense, yes, but also claustrophobic, drafty, and very, very dark. The heart of the home. Every shelter needed one essential feature, a fireplace. This was your heater, your stove, your nightlight, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and freezing to death. Settlers built stone or mud chimneys and kept fires going as often as they could. A poorly built chimney might send smoke back into the cabin, leaving everyone coughing and teary-eyed. But without one, you couldn't cook and you couldn't keep warm. Fires had to be tended carefully, too, because losing your fire in the middle of a blizzard meant you might not get it relit until spring thaw. Cold inside, colder outside. Even the best shelters weren't exactly cozy by modern standards. The wind found ways to creep in through cracks. Snow drifted against walls and doors, and without insulation, cabins were often just a few degrees warmer inside than outside, except right next to the fire. Families usually all slept in one room, huddled together under layers of blankets, quilts, or animal skins. Privacy? Forget it. Everyone shared the same space, the same warmth, and probably the same snoring. Shelter building stories. History is full of accounts of families barely finishing shelters in time. Some built only 3 walls and hung canvas or blankets for the 4th, hoping to finish later. Others worked until their hands bled, cutting and hauling wood until nightfall, then sleeping in half-finished cabins. And some didn't make it. Poor planning, late arrivals, or just bad luck meant that not everyone survived their first winter. It was a harsh reminder that the frontier didn't forgive mistakes. Imagine yourself there now. Let's bring this back to you. Imagine standing with an axe in your hand, knowing the only thing between your family and a freezing death is how many logs you can chop before nightfall. Would you know how to notch a log? Could you drag one twice your weight through the snow? Could you build a fireplace from scratch? It's a lot less romantic when you picture yourself actually doing it. Suddenly, that dugout in the hillside doesn't sound so bad, right? The first test of survival for frontier settlers. Building shelter wasn't just about construction, it was the first test of survival. If you got it done in time, you had a fighting chance to make it through winter. If you didn't, well, winter usually won. So when you curl up tonight in your warm bed, maybe glance around your room. A roof that doesn't leak, walls that keep the wind out, glass windows, central heating. Even compared to a log cabin, sod house, or dugout, you're basically living in luxury. And trust me, frontier settlers would have traded places with you in a heartbeat. Food, hunting, trapping, and praying. So you've got a roof over your head now. It's not fancy, the chimney smokes a little too much, and you swear something's scratching around in the sod walls at night. But hey, it's shelter. Congratulations, you won't freeze to death on day one. But here comes the next big question. What's for dinner? On the frontier, that was a dangerous question to ask, because often the answer was not much. Stocking up before snow falls, settlers had to think about food months in advance. By the time snow covered the ground, the growing season was over. There were no farmers' markets in January, no grocery stores waiting with endless shelves of bread, milk, and butter. Families worked all summer and fall to fill their cellars. They dried beans and corn, cured meat, and stored root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, and onions in the cool earth. Jars of pickles, dried apples, and maybe if they were lucky a little honey or molasses were tucked away. The problem: no matter how carefully you planned, the supplies never seemed to stretch quite far enough. Winters were long, kids ate more than you expected, and sometimes food spoiled or got raided by mice. A full cellar in October could look dangerously bare by February. Hunting in the cold, that's where hunting came in. Deer, rabbits, and sometimes bigger game like elk or bison were crucial sources of food. A single deer could feed a family for weeks if they managed to dry or smoke the meat. But hunting in winter wasn't easy. Snow made travel slow, and animals grew scarcer the colder it got. Settlers had to track footprints, set traps, and often wander far from home in freezing temperatures. Every hunting trip was a gamble. You might come home with food, or you might come home empty-handed and frostbitten. And then there were the wolves. Nothing like hauling a fresh deer carcass back to the cabin only to realize you're being followed by a hungry pack. The frontier menu sometimes included you if you weren't careful. Trapping, nature's grocery store when hunting didn't work. Trapping sometimes did. Small animals like rabbits, squirrels, and muskrats could be caught with snares or steel traps. Their meat might not be glamorous, but it was food. Their furs, meanwhile, could be used for clothing or traded. Settlers learned tricks from Native Americans who had perfected trapping methods over generations. A well-placed trapline might keep a family fed through the lean months. But again, traps didn't guarantee success. Sometimes you trudged through the snow 4 miles, checked every trap, and found nothing. Just frozen fingers and disappointment. Creative cooking. When the food supply got thin, settlers got creative. Frontier recipes weren't about taste so much as survival. Cornmeal mush was common, basically cornmeal boiled in water until it was thick and bland. Johnny cakes, a kind of cornmeal flatbread, were another staple. Beans appeared in nearly every meal, sometimes with salt pork if you had any left. If flour was on hand, families baked rough loaves of bread in Dutch ovens. Without yeast, they made soda bread with baking soda or sour milk. Sweet treats were rare, maybe molasses cookies if you'd saved enough sugar. And then there was pemmican, a survival food borrowed from native traditions, dried meat mixed with fat and sometimes berries. It didn't win awards for flavor, but it kept you alive. When things got desperate, despite all this preparation, many families still ran out of food. Harsh winters dragged on longer than expected. Hunting failed. Crops hadn't produced enough. And that's when desperation set in. Some settlers resorted to boiling leather to make a kind of soup. Others scraped bark from trees or dug for hidden roots under the snow. History is full of accounts of families rationing down to 1 meal a day or less. And in the very worst winters, starvation was real. People wasted away. Neighbors sometimes shared until everyone was on the brink, and tragedies struck entire communities. The frontier wasn't just cold, it was hungry. Food wasn't just fuel despite the scarcity. Food was more than just survival. Sitting down for a meal gave families comfort and a sense of normalcy. A pot of beans simmering on the hearth, a loaf of bread warm from the oven, these were small joys that reminded people why they were enduring all this hardship in the first place. Mealtimes were also when stories were told, prayers were said, and laughter was shared. Even a thin stew felt like a feast if everyone was together around the fire. Imagine yourself at the table, so let's put you there. You're sitting in a dim log cabin, the wind howling outside. The families huddled close to the fire, and in the pot is tonight's dinner: beans, a scrap of salt pork, and some stale cornbread on the side. It's not a 5-star meal. It's not even a 1-star meal. But when you're half frozen and your stomach growls like a bear, That pot of beans suddenly feels like heaven. You eat slowly, savoring each bite, because you don't know how much is left in the cellar. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow you'll be back out in the snow, hoping your traps caught something, or maybe praying you spot a deer. Could you survive? Here is the real test. Could you make it through a whole winter on beans, cornbread, and whatever unlucky rabbit you managed to snare? Could you go without sugar, coffee, or even fresh vegetables for months at a time? Most of us today would grumble if our favorite snack wasn't in the pantry. On the frontier, you didn't have the luxury of being picky. You ate what you had or you didn't eat at all. So the next time you open your fridge and sigh because there's nothing good, just remember at least your dinner doesn't involve boiling your shoes. Firewood, the true frontier currency shelter. Check. Food, sort of, but none of it matters without firewood. Out on the frontier, firewood wasn't just fuel for the stove, it was life itself. If you had enough, you stayed warm, cooked your meals, and maybe even enjoyed a little light in the long winter nights. If you didn't, well, let's just say nobody wrote cheerful songs about freezing in a cabin. So let's talk about what was, in many ways, the real currency of the frontier. Wood. The winter math problem before winter set in. Every family faced the same terrifying question. How much firewood do we need to make it through? The answer was always, more than you think. A typical family needed 15 to 20 cords of wood to survive a full winter. That's a pile of logs about as big as a small house. And remember, every single piece of it had to be chopped by hand with an axe or saw, holed, split, and stacked. No chainsaws, no log splitters, just sweat and saw muscles. It wasn't a chore, it was a season-long obsession. Run out of wood in February, and you'd be in serious trouble. Chopping until your arms fall off. Settlers spent late summer and fall chopping as many trees as possible. Men, and often boys old enough to swing an axe, would head into the woods 4 hours at a time. First came the felling. You'd pick a straight tree, swing your axe in rhythm, and hope it didn't fall the wrong way and crush you or your cabin. Then came limbing, sawing, splitting, and hauling. The work was endless, repetitive, and exhausting. Settlers joked that would warmed you twice, once when you chopped it, and again when you burned it. Honestly, it was probably warming them 3 or 4 times, considering how much sweat went into the whole process. Stacking like your life depends on it. Once chopped, the wood had to be stacked to dry. Wet or green wood smoked terribly and gave little heat. Properly dried wood burned hotter and cleaner. Families built careful stacks, often near the house, and covered them to keep off snow and rain. A well-stacked wood pile wasn't just practical, it was a symbol of survival. Neighbors could glance at your pile and know whether you were likely to make it through the winter. A skimpy stack meant you'd either be knocking on doors for help or, worse, shivering in your cabin hoping spring came early. What they burned, not all wood was created equal. Some burned hot and long, like oak or hickory. Others burned fast and weak, like pine or poplar. Settlers learned which trees gave the most bang for their backbreaking buck. Hardwoods were the prize, but you burned what you had. In treeless areas, families burned buffalo chips, yes, dried bison dung, or twisted bundles of prairie grass. Not glamorous, but if it made flames, it was fuel. Fire. The heart of the cabin inside. The fire was everything. It was the heater, the stove, the dryer, the light source, and the family gathering spot. Without firewood, none of that happened. Imagine a winter night, outside. The wind howls and snow piles against the door. Inside, a single fire crackles in the hearth. Everyone huddles close, because beyond that circle of warmth the cabin is icy. The fire has to be fed constantly. Let it die, and the temperature drops instantly. That's why kids were often tasked with fetching in more wood. And let me tell you, no kid on the frontier rolled their eyes at that choric. Was the difference between toasty toes and frostbite. The fear of running out. Every log burned was a little countdown timer toward spring. Settlers watched their piles shrink with dread. A harsh blizzard could eat through weeks' worth of wood. Some families rationed fires, letting them die down during the day to save fuel. This meant wearing coats indoors, cooking quickly, and sleeping under mountains of blankets. Others risked hypothermia just to stretch their supplies. Running out of wood before spring wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. People froze in their cabins. Families sometimes had to tear apart furniture or even wooden fences to keep fires burning just a little longer. Trading in wood, because it was so essential, would sometimes become a kind of local currency. A neighbor might trade a few cords for food, livestock, or tools. A man with strong arms and extra time could earn a reputation and a bit of income by chopping wood for others. And when communities pulled together helping widows, the sick, or families with too many young kids, wood was often the first thing shared. Well, bring you some logs was the frontier version of bringing over a casserole. Fires were dangerous, too, of course. Having constant flames inside a wooden cabin wasn't exactly safe. Chimneys cracked, sparks flew, and sometimes whole cabins burned down in the middle of winter. Imagine surviving the cold only to lose everything to one stray ember. So settlers walked a fine line. Too little fire and you froze. Too much fire and you risked disaster. Keeping that perfect balance was part of daily life. Imagine yourself in the snow. All right, let's put you there. It's a freezing January morning. You wake up, breath fogging in the air, and realize the fire's burned low. You drag yourself out of bed, pull on frozen boots, and shuffle outside. The woodpile is half buried in snow. You dig out a few logs with numb fingers, haul them inside, and toss them on the coals. Slowly, blessed warmth spreads through the cabin. The kids sigh with relief. Your spouse puts on the kettle, and you think, thank goodness we chopped enough, until you glance at the shrinking pile and do the math. February is still ahead, and so is March. Better grab that axe and start swinging. Could you survive? So, how about you? Could you chop, split, haul, and stack enough wood to last 4 or 5 freezing months? Could you wake up in the middle of the night to feed the fire, again and again, knowing your family depended on it? For most of us today, keeping warm means tapping a thermostat on the wall. But out on the frontier, warmth came one sweaty swing of the axe at a time. And if you couldn't keep the fire going, you didn't keep going either. Clothing, dressing in animal skins, all right. So you've got a cabin over your head, a woodpile stacked as high as a horse, and a pot of beans simmering on the hearth. But there's still a problem. You can't exactly spend the entire winter sitting by the fire. You have to haul water, check traps, chop more wood, feed animals, maybe even make the long trek to a neighbor's place. And to do any of that, you need clothing that can stand up to the kind of cold that makes your teeth chatter just looking out the window. Frontier winters weren't kind to anyone who underestimated them. Without proper clothing, you weren't just uncomfortable, you were risking frostbite, hypothermia, or worse. So let's talk about what settlers actually wore when the world outside turned into a frozen nightmare. Wool, leather, and layers. There were no fancy synthetic fabrics in the 1800s, no fleece, no waterproof jackets, no heated socks. Frontier settlers had to make do with what nature provided, mainly wool, leather, and fur. Wool was the superstar. It kept you warm even when wet, and it was thick enough to block wind. Families spun wool from sheep, knit it into socks, scarves, and mittens, and wove it into coats and blankets. If you had enough wool, you were doing all right. Leather and fur added extra insulation. Deer hides, rabbit skins, and especially buffalo robes were prized. Buffalo hides were like nature's heavy-duty winter coat, massive, thick, and almost impossible to feel cold under. Settlers wrapped themselves in them blankets, sometimes even draping them over beds at night. And the key to survival: layers, lots of layers, several shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, socks over socks, and mittens over mittens. Settlers looked bulky, clumsy, and not at all fashionable, but when it's 20 below, you don't care how you look. Homemade, always on the frontier. You couldn't just run into town and buy a coat. Clothing was mostly homemade. Women spun, sewed, patched, and repatched until garments were more patch than fabric. A pair of socks might be darned a dozen times before being retired. Kids usually wore hand-me-downs from older siblings, sometimes clothes 2 or 3 sizes too big. You didn't outgrow your clothes, you just wore them until they literally fell apart. Shoes were a constant struggle. Leather boots were expensive, and settlers often stretched them far beyond their natural lifespan. Some families stuffed rags or straw inside to keep out drafts. Others resorted to wrapping feet in fur or scraps of cloth when boots finally gave out. Animal skins, the real frontier fashion when winter got truly brutal. Animal skins became essential. Settlers learned much from Native American clothing traditions, which were perfectly adapted to harsh climates. Deerskin leggings, fur-lined moccasins, rabbit fur mittens, all of these kept out the cold far better than plain fabric. Fox, wolf, and coyote pelts became hoods and collars. And buffalo robes, those were the ultimate luxury, big enough to wrap an entire family. The funny part is, these clothes weren't just practical, they were loud. Imagine trudging through the snow on a full bearskin coat. You looked more like a beast than a person. If a settler time traveled into a modern ski resort, wearing what they wore back then, people would either applaud or run. The battle against frostbite, even with layers, frostbite was a constant danger. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were especially at risk. Settlers wrapped scarves tight around their faces until only their eyes peeked out. But sometimes that wasn't enough. Frostbite could turn skin white, then black, and if it got bad enough, you could lose fingers or toes. There are stories of settlers returning from errands with frozen hands so stiff they couldn't untie their own boots. Snow blindness was another hazard. Sunlight reflecting off snow could burn your eyes. To prevent it, some settlers copied native designs for snow goggles, slits cut into pieces of wood or bone, which looked odd, but worked surprisingly well. Laundry in winter. Forget it. One thing that modern folks might not think about: laundry. Imagine trying to wash and dry heavy wool garments when it's freezing outside. Clothes froze stiff on the line, and water for washing had to be hauled, heated, and then carefully rationed. So laundry didn't happen much in winter. You wore the same wool shirt day after day, sometimes week after week. Everyone smelled like smoke from the fire anyway, so it sort of evened out. Not glamorous, but practical. Kids versus the cold. Children on the frontier had it especially rough. Their clothing was often thin, patched, and barely enough to keep out the cold. Many kids went barefoot in summer, which toughened up their feet, but didn't prepare them for January snow. Mothers bundled them as best they could: scarves, mittens, layers of whatever fabric was available. But frostbite on kids' toes and fingers was oddly common. And forget sledding in colorful snowsuits. Frontier kids braved the cold in scratchy wool and patched trousers. Imagine yourself suiting up. Picture this. It's a freezing dawn. You need to fetch water from the river. You start layering up: wool shirt, another wool shirt, thick trousers, coat patched at the elbows, scarf, mittens, and finally, heavy boots that pinch your toes. Over it all, you drape a buffalo robe. Now you're waddling out the door, looking less like a pioneer and more like a walking carpet. Every step is clumsy. Your breath fogs the air. The scarf itches your chin. And still, somehow, the cold cuts through. Your eyelashes frost together. Your toes go numb. You mutter under your breath, "Why did anyone settle here?" But of course, there's no one around to hear you complain. Could you survive? So here is the question. Could you survive a winter wrapped in wool, patched leather, and stinky animal skins? Could you keep swinging the axe when your mittens were stiff with frost? Could you haul water when your boots leaked and your scarf froze solid? We take modern clothing for granted: zippers, waterproof coats, fleece-lined gloves. On the frontier, every layer came from hard labor, animal hides, or endless hours at the spinning wheel. So next time you pull on your cozy hoodie, just be glad you didn't have to skin a buffalo to make it. Water. Not as simple as it sounds. When you think about surviving winter, water probably isn't the first thing that pops into your head. Firewood, sure. Food, definitely. Warm clothes, of course. But water, that should be easy, right? You just scoop up some snow and let it melt. Done. Well, not exactly. On the frontier, water in winter was a constant battle. It wasn't just about finding it, it was about keeping it liquid, keeping it safe, and keeping it close enough that you didn't freeze your nose off fetching it. Snow isn't always the answer. The easiest source of water in winter was snow. Just grab a bucket of the white stuff, set it by the fire, and wait. But settlers quickly learned that melted snow was frustrating. A full bucket of snow then melt down to only a couple of cups of water, and you needed gallons every day for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Plus, snow wasn't always clean. Dust, ash, or animal droppings could be mixed in. Settlers sometimes strained it through cloth, but it still wasn't exactly refreshing spring water. If you drank snow straight, without melting it, you could actually lower your body temperature and risk hypothermia. In short, snow was better than nothing, but it wasn't the perfect solution. Frozen rivers and wells. Many families relied on rivers, streams, or wells. The problem: in winter, these froze solid or at least developed thick ice on top. Settlers had to chop through with axes to reach liquid water below. Imagine stumbling outside at dawn, trying not to slip, and swinging an axe at a frozen river while your breath fogs up the air. Not the best way to start your morning. Wells could be tricky too. The deeper ones didn't always freeze, but the buckets and ropes used to draw water often iced over. You'd lower a bucket down, haul it up, and by the time you carried it back to the cabin, a crust of ice had already formed. Hauling water, the endless chore fetching water, was a non-stop job. Settlers needed it for cooking, drinking, washing, and caring for livestock. One person might make several trips a day, lugging heavy wooden buckets across icy ground. Now imagine slipping on that ice while carrying a bucket. Not only do you spill the water, but you also end up soaked in freezing temperatures. Wet clothes in winter could be deadly. Many settlers learned the hard way that staying dry was almost as important as staying warm. Water for animals. It wasn't just people who needed water. Cows, horses, and chickens did too. Settlers chopped holes in frozen ponds for livestock to drink from. If the animals were kept in barns, water had to be carried to them, often multiple times a day. Keeping the animals hydrated was crucial, since they provided milk, eggs, and muscle power for work. Let the livestock go without water, and suddenly survival became even harder for the family. The risk of contamination here is another issue. Dirty water. In the winter, it was tempting to drink straight from melted snow or from streams. But germs don't take holidays just because it's cold outside. Contaminated water could lead to diseases like dysentery or cholera. Even in freezing weather, boiling was the safest option, but firewood was precious. Every log burned for boiling water was a log not warming the cabin. Settlers constantly had to balance. Do we stay warm, or do we stay hydrated without getting sick? Ice harvesting, a chilly business in some areas, especially where settlements grew bigger. Families harvested ice. They cut huge blocks from lakes and rivers, stored them in ice houses insulated with straw or sawdust, and used them later for cooling food. But for the average frontier settler, ice wasn't about luxury, it was just in the way. You wanted liquid water, not a frozen slab you had to hack apart before breakfast. Laundry and bathing. We've already talked about how laundry was almost impossible in winter, but water made it even more so. Heating enough water for a wash required hours of work. Bathing was rare, and when it happened, it usually meant a quick splash rather than a full soak. Settlers joked about Saturday baths, but in winter, even that could be skipped. After all, hauling and heating 20 gallons of water in freezing weather wasn't anyone's idea of fun. People just layered on more clothes and hoped nobody minded the smell. Picture this: your daily water run. Let's imagine you again. It's morning, your cabin is warm, but the water bucket by the hearth is empty. Time to fetch more. You pull on your stiff mittens, wrap your scarf tight, and step outside. The air stings your face. You carry the bucket to the well, chop at the ice covering it, and lower the rope. You hear the splash as the bucket fills. Hauling it up takes all your strength. Cold ropes biting your fingers through the mittens Then, carefully, you trudge back toward the cabin. Halfway there, you slip on the icy path. You save the bucket, but now your mittens are wet, and your breath is coming in sharp, icy bursts. By the time you stagger inside, you feel like you've run a marathon in slow motion, and that's just one trip. Could you survive? So the question stands, could you survive hauling water through snow every single day, keeping it from freezing, boiling it so it wouldn't make you sick, and carrying enough for both your family and your animals? Could you stay dry and avoid frostbite, even when buckets leaked or spilled? We barely think about turning on a tap today, but for frontier settlers, water was a daily fight against ice, cold, and exhaustion. Every drop came with effort. So the next time you pour yourself a glass of water, maybe raise it in honor of the settlers who had to chop through a frozen river just to get the same thing. Sickness and survival. If there's one thing you really didn't want on the frontier, it was getting sick in the middle of winter. Today, if you feel a cold coming on, you just grab some cough syrup, call the doctor, and curl up in bed with Netflix. Back then, no syrup, no doctor, and curling up usually just meant hoping you didn't freeze to death under a stack of itchy wool blankets. Winter sickness was one of the biggest threats to frontier life. The cold months trapped families indoors, germs spread easily, and the lack of proper medicine made every cough a potential disaster. Common winter illnesses. The frontier had its own greatest hits of sickness. Pneumonia, the big one. A little cough could turn into fluid in the lungs, and without antibiotics, that was often deadly. Influenza, the flu swept through cabins fast. One person sick meant the whole family sick. Frostbite, not exactly an illness, but plenty of fingers and toes were lost to it. Chilblains, painful swelling of the skin from repeated cold exposure. Scurvy, yes, the sailor's disease. Lack of fresh fruits and veggies in winter meant vitamin C deficiency. Gums bled, teeth loosened, and people felt constantly weak. Even something as simple as a toothache or stomach bug could spiral out of control when you were miles from the nearest settlement. Doctors. What doctors? Frontier medicine was, let's just say, improvised. If you were lucky, a settlement might have one doctor, but in many cases, the doctor was just someone with a few medical books and a willingness to poke around wounds. Most families had to treat themselves with what they had on hand. Home remedies, folk cures, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. Herbs like peppermint, chamomile, and willow bark were common. Honey was used for coughs. Whiskey, too, found its way into plenty of medicinal recipes. And yes, sometimes the whiskey made people feel better, even if it didn't cure anything. Folk remedies, some helpful, some hilarious. Frontier folks got creative when treating illness. Some remedies were surprisingly effective, like boiling pine needles into a tea for vitamin C. Others were less convincing. For example, rubbing goose fat on your chest for pneumonia, tying a bag of garlic around your neck to ward off illness, drinking turpentine for worms. Please don't try this at home. When medicine was scarce, people clung to whatever folk wisdom they could. Even if it didn't work, at least it gave them a sense of control. The problem of infection winter wasn't just about coughs and colds. Any cut or injury carried the risk of infection. A small wound from chopping wood could turn life-threatening. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, infections often spread. Families tried cleaning wounds with alcohol or herbal washes, but success was hit or miss. And remember, traveling to a doctor in winter meant trudging through snow 4 miles, possibly in a blizzard. So many settlers just did. They hoped for the best and prayed the fever would break. Cabin fever, literally being stuck indoors all winter, made illnesses spread like wildfire. Families huddled together in one-room cabins, sharing the same air day and night. If one person sneezed, everyone else would be sneezing within days. And on top of physical sickness, there was mental strain. Cabin fever was a real issue. The long, dark winters with little social interaction led to anxiety, irritability, and sometimes even breakdowns. People fought, sulked, or grew deeply depressed. Storytelling, music, and prayer helped, but sometimes The mind suffered as much as the body. Children and the elderly, kids and older folks were especially vulnerable. Childhood illnesses like measles or whooping cough could tear through families in winter, and without vaccines, mortality was heartbreakingly high. Elderly settlers, too, struggled to survive harsh winters. Cold weather made existing health problems worse, and simple infections could become deadly. Every winter was a test of strength, especially for the most vulnerable. Survival strategies. So how did people fight sickness when the odds were stacked against them? Prevention. Settlers bundled up, stayed dry, and ate what they could to keep up their strength. Herbal knowledge. Many families grew or gathered herbs during the warmer months, drying them for winter use. Rest and warmth. Not much has changed. Getting plenty of rest near the fire was one of the best treatments available. Faith and community. Prayer, hymns, and storytelling provided comfort when medicine failed. Neighbors sometimes walked miles through snow to deliver food, herbs, or just moral support. A day in the sick room. Let's picture it. The cabin is quiet except for the crackle of the fire. One of the children is coughing under a heap of quilts. The air feels heavy, not just from smoke but from worrying. Mother mixes up a tea of pine needles and honey, while father stares at the door, wishing a doctor lived closer than 50 miles away. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, time stretches painfully slow. Every cough makes the family hold their breath. Will it pass? Will it get worse? That kind of tension was part of everyday life in winter. Could you survive? Here is the question. If you caught pneumonia in a log cabin in 1842, without antibiotics, could you tough it out? Could you trust a poultice of herbs, a splash of whiskey, and maybe a prayer to pull you through? Modern life makes us forget how fragile people were back then. A sore throat today is annoying back then. It could mark the beginning of the end. Survival on the frontier wasn't just about chopping wood or hauling water. It was also about fighting invisible enemies, bacteria, viruses, and the crushing weight of isolation. Winter made everything harder, and sickness turned a hard season into a deadly one. So next time you sneeze and reach for a tissue, maybe be grateful you're not relying on goose fat and garlic necklaces. Loneliness and cabin fever. Picture this. It's mid-January. The snow is piled so high outside your cabin that opening the door feels like shoving against a wall of ice. The wind howls through the trees like a pack of wolves, and the sky has been grey for weeks. You're stuck inside one room with your family. No Wi-Fi, no pizza delivery, and absolutely zero personal space. Welcome to Cabin Fever, Frontier Edition. What was cabin fever? Back then, cabin fever wasn't just a figure of speech. It was a genuine mental strain settlers experienced from being cooped up in tiny log homes through the long winter months. With the cold and snow keeping people indoors, normal routines collapsed. Travel was dangerous, neighbors were far away, and daylight hours were short. People went stir-crazy, sometimes literally. Irritability, depression, and restlessness set in. Imagine being trapped with the same few faces every single day, 4 months, with nowhere to escape. The cabin itself first. Let's remember how small these homes were. A typical frontier cabin had to be 12 by 12 feet, basically the size of a modern bedroom. One room served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom for the whole family. There might be one small window, often covered with greased paper instead of glass. That meant very little natural light. Add a smoking fire and the smell of damp clothes drying, and it wasn't exactly a cheerful environment. The walls creaked. The wind slipped through the cracks. Privacy? Forget it. If you wanted alone time, your best bet was walking outside into a snowstorm. The emotional toll the endless dark and cold wore on people. Depression was common, though they didn't have a name for it then. Settlers just called it melancholy or the winter blues. Boredom didn't help. Once the chores were done, wood cut, animals fed, there wasn't much else to do. People grew short-tempered. Siblings bickered. Couples argued. Parents snapped at kids. Sometimes loneliness wasn't about being alone at all, but about being cut off from the larger world. You could be sitting next to your family and still feel utterly isolated. Coping strategies, of course. Frontier families found ways to keep spirits up. Humans are pretty resourceful when it comes to fighting boredom. Here is how they handled it. Storytelling. Families shared ghost tales, Bible stories, or family histories by firelight. Oral storytelling was entertainment and tradition rolled into one. Music. If someone had a fiddle, harmonica, or banjo, it was gold. Singing and playing music lightened the mood. Games, card games, checkers, or homemade board games gave people something to focus on. Crafting, knitting, sewing, or carving helped pass the hours, while also producing useful items. Reading. If a family owned books or a Bible, they'd be read again and again until everyone practically knew them by heart. Even so, those activities only went so far when winter dragged on 4 months. Kids and cabin fever children especially struggled. Imagine being an 8-year-old with boundless energy, stuck inside a cabin for weeks. Parents often sent kids outside to burn off steam, but that only worked if the weather wasn't too brutal. Inside, kids played simple games, marbles, whittled toys, or pretend play, but many were also put to work. Cabin fever or not, they had chores, hauling water, gathering kindling, helping with sewing. Keeping busy was one way to fight boredom. Still, children got restless, and restless kids in a tiny cabin. Not exactly a recipe for a harmony. Adults and the strain of silence for adults. Loneliness often took the form of silence. Many cabins were miles from the nearest neighbor, so social visits were rare. A blizzard could cut families off completely for weeks. The quiet became oppressive. Without letters or newspapers, people lost track of what was happening outside their valley. Some settlers later wrote that they felt forgotten by the world during those endless winters. Faith helped prayer, and hymn singing gave structure to long days. But not everyone found comfort. Some turned to alcohol, which sometimes worsened the mood instead of helping. Cabin fever in the records. There are actual accounts of settlers snapping under the pressure of isolation. Journals describe people pacing 4 hours, staring into the fire, or even talking to themselves just to fill the silence. One frontier wife admitted she sometimes wanted to walk out into the snow and keep walking. That might sound dramatic, but it shows how serious the psychological strain was. Survival wasn't only about keeping the body alive, it was about keeping the mind steady. Community relief, whenever weather allowed. Community gatherings were lifesavers. Neighbors would come together for barn dances, quilting bees, or religious meetings. These events weren't just fun, they were mental health breaks. Laughing, singing, and seeing new faces recharged people. Some families planned visits weeks in advance, knowing they'd be cut off again once the next snowstorm came. Those brief bursts of social life were precious. Could you survive the silence? Here is the big question. Could you handle months of being stuck inside a tiny log cabin, cut off from friends, with nothing but candlelight and the same 5 people for company? No internet, no TV, no texting, just your thoughts, your chores, and maybe a deck of cards. Some settlers thrived on the quiet, finding peace in simplicity. Others barely made it through. Cabin fever was real, and it proved that surviving the frontier wasn't just about strength or toughness, it was about endurance of the spirit. So next time you feel stir-crazy after a rainy weekend indoors, imagine a frontier family living months in one smoky room with no escape. Suddenly, your Netflix backlog doesn't seem so bad. Wildlife, friends and foes. When you think of the frontier, you might picture wide open land, endless trees, and crisp winter air. Sounds peaceful, right? Well, not always. Because while settlers worried about freezing, starving, or running out of firewood, they also had to deal with something else, the neighbors. And by neighbors, I mean bears, wolves, mountain lions, and a whole variety of critters that didn't exactly knock politely before showing up. Winter wildlife, not asleep. After all, it's easy to think that animals just hibernate all winter. Bears, tucked away in their dens. Snakes snoozing underground. Problem solved, right? Not quite. Bears did slow down, but hungry ones sometimes woke up and went sniffing around cabins for food. Wolves didn't hibernate at all. In fact, winter was their prime hunting season, when packs got bold and followed settlers' livestock. Deer and elk still roamed the forests, and if you were lucky and quiet, they provided dinner. Smaller animals like raccoons, rabbits, and foxes were also active, sometimes raiding stored food. So, even though some animals slept through winter, enough of them stayed awake to keep settlers on edge, protecting livestock for frontier families. Animals weren't just pets or farmyard decorations, they were survival. Cows gave milk, chickens gave eggs, horses pulled wagons, and pigs eventually became bacon. Losing livestock meant real danger. Wolves were the biggest threat. Packs would circle farms at night. Drawn by the smell of animals, settlers often built strong pens or barns and kept fires burning to discourage predators. Some even took turns standing guard. A desperate wolf in deep winter wasn't just a danger to livestock, it could attack humans, too. Most settlers respected wolves, but feared them in the hungry months. Bears, the uninvited dinner guests, if wolves were sneaky. Bears were bold. Though many hibernated, some woke early or failed to fatten up before winter. These bears went searching for easy meals. Imagine sitting by your cabin fire when you hear scratching outside, then a thud against the wall. That could be a bear trying to reach the smoked meat hanging inside. In some cases, bears tore open food caches or smashed into barns. For settlers, killing a bear was both dangerous and valuable. Bear meat, fat, and hides were prized, but no one went looking for a fight. They could avoid it because a charging bear could end a frontier story real fast. Mountain lions and coyotes, mountain lions, sometimes called cougars or panthers, were stealthy predators that haunted the edges of settlements. Attacks on people were rare but terrifying. More often, they preyed on deer or livestock. Settlers would sometimes hear the eerie scream of a cougar at night and know to keep children and animals close. Coyotes, meanwhile, were more nuisance than nightmare. They raided chicken coops and scavenged scraps. Clever and adaptable, they could outsmart traps and dogs. Some settlers admired their slyness, while still cursing them for stealing dinner. Smaller pests, bigger problems. Not all wildlife was large and dangerous. Sometimes, the small critters were just as troubling. Mice and rats invaded cabins, chewing through food stores and gnawing on anything soft. Insects like bedbugs and fleas didn't vanish in winter. Inside warm cabins, they thrived. Raccoons loved sneaking into food supplies, sometimes undoing latches settlers thought were secure. It wasn't glamorous, but fighting off pests was a constant part of frontier life. Hunting versus being hunted, of course. Settlers hunted wildlife too. Deer, elk, rabbits, and even squirrels helped keep families fed through the winter. Trapping for beaver or muskrat provided valuable fur. But hunting was risky. A poorly timed trip into the woods could put you face to face with a wolf pack or a starving bear. Even the act of tracking animals in deep snow was exhausting. Still, many families depended on it. Dogs, the unsung heroes, one of the best defenses against wildlife. Dogs. Frontier dogs weren't just companions, they were guardians. They barked at approaching wolves, chased off raccoons, and warned families of danger. Some breeds were strong enough to help pull loads or herd livestock. A good dog could mean the difference between keeping your animals safe or losing them to the night. Fear in the dark for settlers. One of the hardest parts was not knowing what lurked outside. Imagine stepping out of your cabin with a lantern, hearing crunching in the snow nearby, but not knowing if it was a deer or something much hungrier. Children were often told not to wander far, especially at dusk. Many diaries mention the eerie feeling of being watched in the woods. In winter, with food scarce, predators were bold. The frontier could feel less like open land and more like someone else's territory. Stories and legends, encounters with wildlife often grew into stories. A wolf circling the farm became a tale of bravery. A bear raid turned into a family legend, retold by the fire. Some stories exaggerated the danger. Frontier big fish tales about giant wolves or panthers, but others were chillingly true. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were warnings, lessons, and reminders that settlers shared the land with creatures who had lived there long before them. Would you handle it? So, could you handle waking up to wolf howls outside your window? Could you guard your animals through a freezing night, knowing that hungry eyes were watching from the tree line? Some settlers grew used to it, blending fear with respect. Others never stopped feeling uneasy. On the frontier, wildlife wasn't just background scenery, it was a constant, unpredictable player in the fight to survive. So next time your cat knocks over a glass of water, or your dog barks at the mailman, just remember, at least you're not fending off a bear trying to smash into your pantry. The role of community life on the frontier wasn't just about chopping wood, fighting frostbite, or wrestling with wolves. It was also about people. And in a world where winters could turn deadly fast, having good neighbors wasn't just nice, it was survival. Why community mattered? Imagine you're out on the prairie, your cabin half buried in snow, your food running low, and your roof creaking under the weight of ice. Now imagine you've got no one around 4 miles. If something goes wrong, if your axe breaks, if you get sick, if a blizzard traps you indoors, what happens? Well, for a lot of settlers, that meant real danger. But if you had neighbors, suddenly things looked brighter. Community wasn't just about friendship, it was about trading, helping, and watching each other's backs. Barn raisings and shared labor. One of the best known frontier traditions was the barn raising. Building a barn alone could take months, but if the whole community showed up, it could be done in a day. It was like a party mixed with hard labor, men hauling beams, women preparing food, kids running around. Everyone chipped in, because they knew when their turn came, they'd need the same help. That kind of teamwork didn't stop in winter. Settlers might join forces to chop extra firewood, repair fences, or dig out after heavy snow. Survival wasn't a solo sport. Trading and sharing stores were often days away, and not everyone had the same supplies. So neighbors traded constantly. Maybe one family had flour, but no sugar. Another had extra venison, but needed candles. Someone else had a surplus of firewood, but needed help with clothes. It was a simple economy built on trust. And in winter, sharing could mean the difference between eating or going hungry. Gatherings and social life. Even in brutal winters, people craved company. Cabin fever was real, and without social interaction, spirits could sink. That's why settlers created excuses to gather. Church services were often held in someone's home or a simple meeting house, doubling as social events. Storytelling nights helped pass the long evenings. Tales of hunts, hardships, or even silly jokes lightened the mood. Holidays like Christmas or New Year's became bright spots, with feasts, music, and laughter. Small breaks from the struggle. These gatherings weren't just fun. They reminded people that they weren't alone in the wilderness. Watching out for each other, neighbors didn't just share chores or food. They also looked out for danger. If wolves prowled nearby, word spread quickly. If someone got injured, others pitched in with medicine or care. In many communities, widows, the elderly, and orphans were protected by the group. Everyone understood that tragedy could strike any family. Helping each other was the only way the settlement as a whole survived. The role of women in community life. Frontier women often carried the heart of community life. They organized food exchanges, taught children, and offered support during sickness or childbirth. Many women kept in touch with neighbors through regular visits, even if it meant trudging through snow. They carried letters, gossip, and comfort across miles of frozen land. In a way, they were the glue that kept communities connected. Children and play. Believe it or not, kids also played a role in building community. Children were sent on small errands, delivering messages, carrying baskets of food, or helping older neighbors. And when chores were done, they played together, sledding down snowy hills, building snowmen, or just making up games in the cold. For them, winter wasn't just hardship, it was adventure. Their laughter reminded adults that life was more than just survival. Conflict and tension, of course. Frontier communities weren't perfect. Neighbors could argue over land boundaries, hunting rights, or borrowed tools that were never returned. In the close quarters of winter, tempers sometimes flared, but most disputes were solved quickly. After all, you couldn't afford to stay mad when you might need that same neighbor to help dig your cabin out of a snowdrift next week. Survival had a way of forcing forgiveness, community as comfort at the end of a long winter day. Knowing there were other families nearby made life bearable. Settlers might light candles in their windows during storms, signals of life and hope. Children might peek across fields to see smoke rising from another chimney, proof that someone else was enduring the same cold. Even the smallest settlement, 2 or 3 families, created a sense of belonging. In the harsh silence of a frontier winter, that was priceless. Would you thrive in a frontier community? So, how about you? Could you handle sharing everything with your neighbors, trading food, splitting chores, and attending endless storytelling nights by the fire? Some people thrived in that environment, while others found it stifling. But whether you loved it or not, community was survival. Alone, a settler might last a season. Together, families could build a lasting home. So the next time you wave at your neighbor, just remember at least you don't have to rely on them to keep the wolves from eating your chickens. Children of the frontier, when you picture frontier life, you might imagine rugged men chopping wood or women stirring big pots over the fire. But children, oh, they were there too, and trust me, their lives weren't all about skipping through meadows or playing with dolls. On the frontier, kids were little workers, little survivors, and, occasionally, little sources of joy in the middle of all that hardship. Chores from the moment they could walk. For frontier children, childhood ended fast. As soon as you could carry a bucket without spilling it, you were put to work, fetching water from the creek or well. In winter, this meant breaking ice before hauling heavy buckets back home. Collecting firewood, small hands were perfect for grabbing sticks and kindling. Feeding animals, chickens, pigs, and cows all needed attention, even if the snow was knee-deep. Babysitting younger siblings, a 6-year-old was often considered responsible enough. Schooling came second to survival. A kid who slacked off on chores wasn't just lazy, they could endanger the whole family. Winter hazards for kids. Winter was brutal on children. Frostbite could set in quickly as they wandered too far without gloves. Slipping on icy pads could mean a broken bone, and there weren't exactly doctors waiting to fix it. Illness was also a constant threat. Diseases like pneumonia, diphtheria, and the flu hit children hard. A simple fever could turn deadly. Families often lost children during the long winters, and grief was sadly a normal part of frontier life. Learning to be tough despite the dangers. Frontier kids grew up resilient. They learned how to trap rabbits, patch clothes, or start a fire from an early age. By 10, many children could handle a rifle, protect livestock, or help their parents build shelter. Childhood was more like an apprenticeship for survival than a time for play. The rare joys of playtime, but it wasn't all work. Kids found moments of fun, even in winter, sledding down hills on wooden boards or makeshift sleds, snowball fights that turned into miniature battles, homemade toys like rag dolls, carved whistles, or marbles, storytelling games by the fire, with siblings trying to spook each other with ghost tales. Frontier playtime wasn't fancy, but it was creative. Kids squeezed joy out of whatever they could find. Education. If there was time, formal schooling was rare in the depths of winter. Some communities had a one-room schoolhouse, but snow often made travel impossible. Instead, learning happened at home. Parents taught children to read from the Bible or a few precious books. Math lessons often revolved around farming, trading, or measuring supplies. Education was practical. You didn't need poetry to survive the winter, but you sure needed to know how many logs it took to heat the cabin. Responsibility beyond their years. Frontier children often faced adult-level responsibilities far earlier than we'd expect today. A boy of 12 might be trusted to hunt alone. A girl of the same age might be running an entire household if her mother fell ill. It wasn't unusual for kids to experience loss early, too. Losing siblings, parents, or neighbors to disease or accidents forced them to grow up quickly. Childhood was short, and adulthood came fast. The role of community in childhood. Thankfully, children weren't raised in total isolation. Community gatherings gave kids a chance to see other children. They played together at church meetings, barn raisings, or winter festivals. Older kids often looked after younger ones, not just in their own families, but across the settlement. That sense of shared responsibility helped lighten the burden. Resilience and hope despite everything: work, sickness, harsh winters. Children brought hope to the frontier. Their laughter in the snow, their curiosity about the world, and their ability to adapt reminded adults why all the hard work was worth it. In many ways, children symbolized the future settlers were fighting for. Building a cabin, chopping wood, and enduring endless winters wasn't just for survival, it was for the chance that the next generation might have it easier. Would you want to be a frontier kid? So, picture yourself as a frontier child. You wake up at dawn, your breath visible in the icy air, and before you even rub the sleep from your eyes, you're carrying a bucket of water back to the cabin. You work hard, you play when you can, and you learn lessons that might save your life someday. It's tough, no doubt, but kids back then were tougher. They had to be. Next time you hear a child complain about doing the dishes, just remember at least they're not out in a snowstorm hauling water from a frozen river. Frontier women, holding it all together. If the frontier had a backbone, it was often the women. Life out there was already brutal, but for women, it came with double the responsibility, surviving the wilderness and holding families together through endless winters. They weren't just helping, they were running the show in more ways than one. More than just housewives. When we think pioneer women, the picture might be of someone in a long dress stirring stew over the fire. And yes, that happened. But frontier women did way more. They were cooks, nurses, teachers, seamstresses, and sometimes even farmers and hunters when needed. The idea that women stayed in one lane didn't really work in the wilderness. If something had to get done, whoever was around did it. The work never stopped. Let's break it down. A woman's daily winter routine could include cooking 3 meals from scratch, often with limited ingredients, spinning wool and sewing clothes so her family didn't freeze, milking cows, feeding chickens, and tending animals while snow swirled outside, chopping and hauling firewood if the men were away, caring for sick family members with little more than herbs, teas, or home remedies. And that's not counting childcare. Babies still cried at 2 a.m., toddlers still wandered too close to the stove, and teenagers still needed wrangling, same as today, just with frostbite risk. Childbirth on the frontier. Here is where it gets really tough. Childbirth in the frontier wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. Without doctors nearby, women relied on midwives or neighbors to help deliver babies. Complications could be deadly. Still, children were essential to family survival. Since more hands meant more help with work, that meant women often had large families, even knowing the risks. Imagine giving birth in a one-room cabin, snow piling outside, with wolves howling in the distance. It wasn't glamorous, but frontier women endured it over and over. Women as community builders, while men often worked outside the home hunting, trapping, or trading, women created and maintained the community. They organized food exchanges, helped neighbors through illness, hosted gatherings to keep spirits alive in long winters, passed down traditions, songs, and stories. If the men were the muscle of the frontier, women were the glue. Without them, settlements would have fallen apart fast. Handling emergencies alone, frontier men sometimes left 4 days or weeks on hunts or trips for supplies. That left women to handle everything alone. If the roof caved in from snow, she fixed it. If predators threatened the livestock, she grabbed the rifle. If a child fell sick in the middle of a blizzard, she found a way to treat it. Women had to be brave and resourceful, often without anyone to lean on. Survival demanded it. Winter clothing and survival skills. One of the most underrated roles of women was making clothes. Store-bought fabric was rare and expensive, so women spun wool, tanned hides, and sewed garments tough enough for brutal winters. Every warm mitten, every patched coat, every quilt laid across a bed represented hours of labor. Without that, families simply wouldn't make it through. Emotional strength, it wasn't just physical survival, though. Women also provided emotional survival. Imagine being snowed in for weeks. Spirits could sink fast. Women often kept morale up with songs, stories, prayers, or by simply reminding everyone that spring would come eventually. They gave families the hope to keep going, which in many ways was just as important as food or firewood. Frontier women in legends and stories. Over time, stories of tough frontier women became part of American folklore, from famous figures like Laura Ingalls Wilder's mother to countless unnamed women who never made it into history books. Their grit shaped frontier life, immersed as much as men's. They weren't background characters, they were leaders in their own right. Would you manage as a frontier woman? Picture yourself in their shoes or boots. Probably. Could you haul water through waist-deep snow, sew coats for 6 kids, cook dinner without running water, and then help deliver a neighbor's baby all before bed? Frontier women didn't have a choice. They just did it, day after day. The heart of the frontier, at the end of the day. Frontier women weren't just holding it together, they were building the future. Every meal, every quilt, every word of encouragement helped families survive another brutal winter. They may not have gotten the glory, but without them, the frontier dream would have frozen solid. The men, hunters, defenders, and providers. If frontier women were the glue, then frontier men were often the muscle. Their days were packed with hunting, chopping, hauling, building, and when needed, defending. Life didn't exactly leave time for lounging in a rocking chair. A man's job on the frontier was simple in theory: keep the family alive. In practice, it was backbreaking, dangerous, and endless. The weight of responsibility. Frontier men carried enormous pressure. If they failed to hunt, the family starved. If they failed to cut enough wood, everyone froze. If they failed to protect the homestead, wolves, bandits, or blizzards could take everything. Survival often hinged on their shoulders. That responsibility shaped how men lived, worked, and even thought. The daily grind. Winter days weren't cozy snow globe scenes for frontier men. A typical day might look like this: chopping wood. Always, wood was life. Without a towering stack outside the cabin, death was knocking. Checking traps, snares and deadfalls provided meat and fur, but only if checked regularly, no matter the weather. Hunting. A man might spend hours tracking a deer or rabbit through knee-deep snow, sometimes returning empty-handed. Repairing structures, roof leaks, barn doors, fences, everything needed constant attention. Guarding the homestead. Predators, both animal and human, were real threats. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Hunters of the wild. Hunting wasn't just about skill, it was about survival strategy. A single deer could feed a family for weeks. Rabbits and squirrels filled stew pots when bigger game was scarce. Frontier men knew the land like the back of their hands. Animal tracks, weather science, hidden trails. Missing a shot wasn't just disappointing. It could mean days of hunger. And winter hunting was brutal. Fingers froze on rifle triggers, snow-muffled footsteps, and long treks could drain energy fast. Men risked frostbite, or worse, just to bring home supper. Defenders of the cabin. Life on the frontier also meant defense. Settlers faced wild animals like wolves and mountain lions, outlaws or raiders looking to steal supplies, harsh storms threatening to collapse roofs or fences. Men often stood watch or slept lightly, ready to grab a rifle at the first sign of danger. Protecting the family wasn't a sometime thing, it was constant. Providers beyond hunting. Men weren't only hunters, they were also the ones to trade furs or goods at distant posts, barter with neighbors for supplies, scout new land for farming or building. Traveling for a trade meant braving icy rivers or snow-covered trails. A supply run wasn't like running to the store. It could be a week-long trek through freezing wilderness. The toll of hard labor, the work broke bodies down fast. Axes caused injuries, snowstorms led to frostbite, and hauling logs wrecked backs. Many men aged quickly, wrinkled, weathered, and grey long before their time. Alcohol sometimes became a coping tool. Harsh whiskey was common on the frontier, not just for drinking but for disinfecting wounds or trading. But for some men, it became a way to dull the endless grind. Teaching the next generation, one of a man's unspoken duties, was training his sons and sometimes daughters in survival. That meant teaching how to set a trap, how to track game, how to aim a rifle, how to chop wood without losing a toe. These weren't hobbies, they were lifelines. Passing them on meant ensuring the family line could keep surviving. Men in community roles, frontier men, weren't isolated loners all the time. They came together for tasks that required brute strength, like barn raisings, hunting parties, or defending settlements. They also carried leadership roles in towns, serving as sheriffs, traders, or militia leaders. In many ways, men provided the outward-facing protection that gave families a chance to breathe inside their cabins. The emotional side, while men were seen as stoic providers, the emotional strain was real. Imagine the pressure of returning empty-handed from a hunt, knowing your family had nothing for supper, or the guilt of not cutting enough wood before a blizzard hit. Frontier masculinity demanded toughness, but that didn't mean men didn't feel fear or despair. They just didn't always show it. Would you last as a frontier man? Now picture yourself out there. Sunrise means swinging an axe 4 hours. Lunch means chewing tough jerky if you're lucky. Afternoon means trudging into the woods with a rifle, hoping to track a deer before dark. And after that, fix the barn roof before it caves in from snow. No gyms, no days off, no mental health breaks, just endless work. Would you last? The backbone of survival in the end. Frontier men weren't heroes in shining armor, they were worn out, calloused, and determined. Their job was to keep their families alive, day after freezing day. And though women were holding families together on the inside, men were out there battling the wilderness head-on. Together, they created a balance that made survival barely possible. Community and neighbors, surviving together. The frontier was tough, no question. But here is the secret. Nobody really survived it alone. The myth of the lone pioneer, axe in hand, staring bravely into the snow while building a life by himself, that's mostly a Hollywood thing. In reality, communities were the difference between life and death. Neighbors weren't just nice to have, they were survival insurance. Why neighbors mattered? Let's be honest, one family could only do so much. You couldn't chop wood, hunt, watch the kids, fix the roof, fight off wolves, and still have dinner on the table without help. That's where neighbors came in. On the frontier, neighbors were emergency backup crews when blizzards knocked down cabins, doctors by default, showing up with herbs, remedies, or just an extra set of hands, borrow and lend partners, trading tools, food, or livestock, emotional lifelines, keeping loneliness at bay during long winters. Without neighbors, frontier families might as well have signed up for an early grave. Barn raisings and group work. One of the most famous frontier traditions was the barn raising. If a family needed a barn, they didn't build it alone. Everyone in the community showed up, men with hammers, women with food, kids running around underfoot. By sundown, a barn was standing. It wasn't just efficient, it bonded people together. Winter was easier when you knew the guy down the road had your back. And it wasn't just barns. Communities worked together on harvests, fences, road clearing, those storms, hunting parties. When survival tasks were shared, they felt a little lighter. Sharing food and supplies. Food shortages were common in winter. If one family's hunt failed or a blizzard wiped out a cellar, neighbors stepped in. A few sacks of flour traded here. A side of venison offered there. It all kept families alive. In return, the family who was helped was expected to pay it forward later. Frontier generosity wasn't charity, it was reciprocity. Today I help you, tomorrow you help me. That's how trust grew. Neighbors as first responders. No hospitals, no ambulances. Neighbors were the first and only responders in emergencies. If a child fell through the ice, or if someone broke a leg chopping wood, word spread fast. People dropped everything to help. It could mean riding miles through a snowstorm, just to bring blankets or sit at someone's bedside. Nobody clocked in or out, it was simply what you did to keep your community alive. Keeping spirits up, frontier winters were long and dark. Isolation could crush the spirit. That's why communities gathered for church services, even if it meant traveling in snow, dances and social nights, often with a fiddle, some stomping boots, and laughter that kept the cold at bay. Storytelling, passing down folktales, or just sharing funny mishaps. Neighbors reminded each other that life wasn't only about chopping wood and dodging frostbite. There was joy, too, even in the harshest winters. Handling conflict, of course. Not every neighborly relationship was sunshine and fiddle music. People argued over land boundaries, livestock wandering, or borrowed tools that never came back. But frontier life had a way of pushing people to make peace fast. Holding grudges was a luxury. If your neighbor was the only one with a team of oxen, you'd need him eventually. So while fights happened, survival usually forced cooperation. Safety in numbers. A lone cabin was vulnerable. A cluster of families, much stronger. Together, neighbors defended against wild animals, outlaws, natural disasters. The more people banded together, the safer everyone felt. A wolf pack might think twice about circling a settlement with 10 cabins instead of one. Traditions of mutual help. This culture of helping wasn't random, it was almost a code of honor. Settlers understood that survival wasn't about rugged individualism. It was about collective strength. This is why phrases like neighborly duty carried so much weight. Saying no to a neighbor in need wasn't just rude. It was breaking the unspoken contract of survival. Would you be a good frontier neighbor? Imagine being stuck in your cabin during a blizzard, your food running low. Suddenly, your neighbor trudges through the snow with half a smoked ham to share. That might mean the difference between surviving or starving. Now flip it. Would you trek to miles in sub-zero winds just to patch up your neighbor's roof? On the frontier, that was the expectation. So ask yourself, would you have been a good neighbor, or the one everyone side-eyed for never pitching in? Communities made survival possible. At the end of the day, community was the frontier's safety net. No family was strong enough to do it all alone. Survival was stitched together through countless acts of cooperation. Barns built, meals shared, children watched, and fires kept alive. Without neighbors, the brutal frontier winter was unbeatable. With them, families had a fighting chance. Legacy of survival, lessons from the frontier. The frontier winter is long gone, but its echoes are still with us. Those settlers, huddled in cabins with frozen water buckets and endless piles of firewood, left behind more than stories. They left lessons. Their struggles, victories, and stubborn refusal to quit shaped the way later generations thought about survival, community, and even what it means to be tough. So, what can we take away from the brutal winter lives of frontier settlers? Let's settle in, warm our hands by an imaginary fire, and think it through. Lesson 1. Nature doesn't negotiate. If there's one truth the frontier hammered into people, it's that nature makes the rules. Blizzards didn't care if you were tired. Wolves didn't care if you had kids. Winter didn't care if your firewood stack was too small. Settlers couldn't bargain with the cold. They had to respect it, plan for it, and adapt to it. That humility, accepting that humans aren't in charge of the natural world, is still a powerful lesson today. Lesson 2. Preparation is everything. Frontier life was basically a game of did you prepare well enough? If you cut enough wood, filled the cellar, patched the roof, and mended the clothes, you had a shot. If you didn't, winter exposed every mistake. This idea that preparation beats luck runs through everything settlers did. And honestly, it still applies. Whether it's studying for a test, budgeting, or just remembering to charge your phone before leaving the house, preparation is survival. Lesson 3. Community beats isolation. The myth of the lone wolf settler is romantic, sure, but real survival depended on neighbors, shared food, group barn raisings, watchflies. It all meant strength. The frontier taught that being self-reliant didn't mean being all alone. It meant bringing your skills to the table so the community, as a whole, could survive. That's a lesson that feels even more important today, when we sometimes forget how much we depend on each other. Lesson 4. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Frontier settlers weren't superheroes. They were regular people, often poor, often scared, often tired. Yet they managed to carve out lives in conditions most of us wouldn't last a week in. That doesn't mean they loved every second of it. Many cursed the cold, cried when food ran low, or felt despair in endless winters. But they kept going anyway. Their endurance proves that ordinary people can rise to challenges they never thought they could face. Lesson 5. Comfort is relative. A frontier settler could see us today. They'd probably faint at the idea of heated houses, electric lights, grocery stores, and fleece blankets. The things we call necessities would seem like luxury beyond imagination. For them, comfort meant not freezing to death, having enough stew in the pot, or getting a rare cup of coffee. It's a reminder that comfort isn't about perfection, it's about what you're used to. Maybe the next time Wi-Fi goes down, we can remember that at least we're not hauling water through snow at midnight. Lesson 6. Stories keep us warm. Yes, survival required wood, food, and shelter. But settlers also leaned on songs, stories, and laughter. Those long winter nights were filled with tales told by firelight, fiddle tunes, and maybe even a round of cornbread if supplies allowed. It shows us that humans don't just need fuel, we need connection. A good story, a shared laugh, a neighborly visit. Sometimes those things are as important as calories when it comes to keeping the spirit alive. The frontier spirit in modern times, of course. We don't face the same dangers anymore. No wolves are circling the suburbs. No blizzard is threatening to knock out a log cabin roof. But the frontier spirit still lingers. You see it in families stocking up before a storm, neighbors checking on each other during power outages, people finding joy in small victories when life gets tough. We might not be chopping firewood all day, but the core lessons: prepare, help each other, endure are still timeless. Would you survive? It's the big question we've been circling all along. Would you, personally, survive a frontier winter? Think back to everything we've covered. Could you chop wood until your arms felt like jelly? Could you eat the same stew 3 nights in a row? Could you carry buckets of icy water while snow stung your face? Could you keep going, even when every part of you screamed for warmth and comfort? Most of us would probably crack. But then again, most settlers probably thought the same at first. And yet, many made it. The legacy they left: frontier settlers didn't just survive winters, they built families, communities, and entire regions out of the struggle. Their persistence is part of why towns exist where wilderness once stretched. Their legacy isn't about how cold it was, but how stubbornly they refused to give in. It's about carrying on, one day at a time, until spring finally arrived. Closing thoughts. So, as we wrap up this journey through the brutal winters of the frontier, maybe take a second to be grateful for warm socks, central heating, and grocery stores that don't require hunting deer. But also, maybe tip your hat figuratively or literally to the men, women, and children who endured conditions we can barely imagine. They remind us that humans are tougher, braver, and more resilient than we sometimes think. Because if they could make it through a frontier winter, maybe we can make it through whatever storms life throws at us.